For 54 years, the FBI carried a file that never closed. No confirmed name, no body, no wreckage of a parachute rotting in the underbrush. Just a quiet man in a business suit who climbed the rear stairs of a Boeing 727 into a freezing November storm and was never seen again. Now, decades after the trail went cold, a fresh wave of forensic work and archival digging has pushed the case further than it has ever gone before. It hasn't produced an ironclad, court-ready confession. What it has produced is the strongest circumstantial case yet assembled, and it points toward a name that fits almost every detail investigators have spent half a century chasing. The afternoon of November 24, 1971, was overcast and cold at Portland International Airport, the kind of low, gray Pacific Northwest sky that makes everything feel closed in. A man who appeared to be in his mid-40s approached the Northwest Orient counter, paid cash, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He wore a dark suit, a white shirt, a thin black tie, and carried a raincoat over one arm. Nothing about him stood out. That, it turned out, was the entire point. Witnesses who tried to describe him later struggled to find anything distinctive to hold on to. Medium height, medium build, calm eyes, a face built for blending into a crowd. He took a seat near the back of the cabin, ordered a drink, and lit a cigarette, as anyone could on a domestic flight in 1971. Not long after takeoff, he passed a folded note to a young flight attendant. She assumed it was a stranger's phone number and tucked it away unread, until he leaned over and quietly told her she'd better take a look, because he had a bomb. The note, written in neat block letters, instructed her to sit beside him. When she asked for proof, he opened his briefcase just enough to reveal a tangle of wires, red cylinders, and a battery. Whether it was a genuine device or an elaborate bluff, no one aboard that plane was in a position to test the theory. What followed set this hijacking apart from the wave of skyjackings that plagued American aviation in that era. There was no shouting, no political manifesto, no desperation. He was composed, precise, almost courteous. He asked for $200,000 in unmarked $20 bills, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck waiting on the tarmac in Seattle. Then he settled back, ordered another drink, and paid his tab in cash, tipping the crew with the change. One of the flight attendants who spent hours near him later said what unsettled her most wasn't the bomb, it was how relaxed he seemed, like a man who had rehearsed this exact scenario in his head many times before. While the plane circled Seattle for nearly 2 hours, the FBI and the airline scrambled to gather the ransom. In a decision that would matter enormously later, agents photographed every single bill before it was loaded onto the aircraft, recording each serial number on microfilm. It was tedious, unglamorous work, and it became the single most important piece of evidence in the entire case. When the plane finally landed in Seattle, the exchange went off with eerie efficiency. He released all 36 passengers and 1 attendant, keeping only a skeleton crew aboard, the pilots, a flight engineer, and 1 remaining attendant who sat close enough to study him for the rest of the flight. He collected the money in a canvas bag, took the parachutes, and issued a new set of instructions that revealed just how much he understood about the aircraft he was standing in. He wanted the plane flown low and slow, under 10,000 feet, gear down, flaps partially extended, cabin unpressurized. These weren't the demands of a man improvising. They were the specifications required to safely open the rear air stair of a 727 in flight, a design quirk unique to that aircraft, one that turned the plane's tail into a ready-made exit ramp. Somewhere over the dense, roadless timber of southwestern Washington, in driving rain and sub-freezing wind, the cockpit crew felt a faint shudder in the airframe and watched a warning light flicker on, indicating the rear stairs had been lowered. When they radioed back to ask if he needed anything, the answer that came was simply no. It was the last anyone ever heard from him. When the aircraft touched down in Reno with its stairs still hanging open, the cabin was empty. He was gone, along with 2 of the 4 parachutes and the entire canvas bag of cash. What he left behind was almost insultingly small. A black clip-on tie discarded on the seat, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, 8 cigarette butts in the ashtray, and a smear of partial fingerprints too mixed with other passengers' prints to be conclusive. For decades, that was the entirety of the physical case, a stranger's leftovers and nothing more. The FBI's manhunt, codenamed Norjack, became one of the largest in the Bureau's history, and one of the first questions investigators had to face was whether the man had even survived the jump. Many agents doubted it. He had leapt at night, in a storm, into wilderness he couldn't see, wearing loafers and a business suit, with no helmet, no gloves, and, critically, a reserve parachute that turned out to be a sealed training model, useless as an actual backup. To some investigators, that detail suggested a reckless amateur who likely never made it to the ground alive. To others, it suggested a man supremely confident he wouldn't need a backup at all. And yet no body was ever recovered. Hundreds of soldiers and volunteers combed the presumed drop zone. Helicopters swept the ridgelines. Divers searched nearby lakes. Nothing turned up, no remains, no shredded canopy, no scrap of suit fabric. That total absence became the engine that kept the legend alive for 50 years, because a case with no ending invites everyone to write their own. The composite sketch built from witness descriptions became one of the most reproduced faces in American criminal history, and for decades it triggered false recognitions everywhere: an uncle, a coworker, a father who came home from a trip with unexplained cash, and a story that never quite added up. Hundreds of names were floated as suspects. Some carried real weight. A former paratrooper whose own relatives quietly believed he might have been the hijacker, a troubled ex-serviceman whose deathbed claims sent investigators chasing a new lead decades later, men who allegedly confessed to spouses only in their final years. Each candidate explained a fragment of Cooper: the aviation knowledge, the calm under pressure, the physical resemblance, but none of them ever accounted for the whole picture. Then, in February of 1980, an 8-year-old boy digging in the sand along the Columbia River at a spot called Tina Bar uncovered 3 decaying bundles of $20 bills, the rubber bands still holding them loosely together. When agents checked the serial numbers against that painstaking 1971 microfilm, the match was confirmed. This was Cooper's money, nearly $6,000 of it, surfacing on a riverbank nearly a decade after the jump. Rather than closing the case, the discovery deepened it. Geologists disagreed over whether the sand layers around the bills were consistent with natural deposition shortly after the hijacking or with a dredging operation that occurred years later, which would mean the cash arrived by some other route entirely. The rubber bands themselves were older than experts expected them to survive intact. The money that should have answered everything instead became its own smaller, nested mystery. For decades after that, the physical evidence sat largely untouched in FBI storage: the tie, the clip, whatever remained of the fingerprint work, while genetic testing and materials science quietly advanced far beyond what investigators in 1971 could have imagined. The cigarette butts, which should have carried a clean DNA profile, were eventually lost somewhere in the long chain of custody, an ordinary bureaucratic failure that closed off what might have been the simplest route to an answer. But the tie survived. In recent years, a group of independent researchers and forensic volunteers, working without a federal budget or subpoena power, gained access to it and examined it under an electron microscope. What they found reframed the entire case. Clinging to the fibers of that cheap department store tie were thousands of microscopic particles, and scattered among the ordinary dust of daily life were traces of rare earth elements and pure titanium, alongside titanium alloys that in 1971 were used almost exclusively in advanced aerospace manufacturing. This wasn't something an average commuter or office worker would pick up walking through their day. It was the kind of residue that settles on someone who spends real time on a factory floor building aircraft or in a metallurgy lab handling specialized alloys. That finding reframed everything the hijacker had done and said on the plane. His knowledge of the 727's air stare, his calm insistence on a specific altitude and airspeed, his understanding of exactly how the aircraft would behave with the stairs open, all of it suddenly read less like a lucky guess and more like the working knowledge of someone who had spent years around exactly that kind of machinery. The tie didn't hand investigators a name, but it narrowed an impossible field: every man in America, down to a far smaller one: men employed in the aerospace industry of the Pacific Northwest, specifically around the manufacturing of high-altitude, titanium-skinned aircraft, in the years surrounding 1971. Working from that narrower field, researchers began cross-referencing employment records, plant rosters, and physical descriptions from the era, and one name kept resurfacing with a consistency that startled even skeptical investigators. A man who had worked directly in that world of exotic alloys and pressurized airframes, whose documented life intersected almost precisely with the particle trail lifted from the tie, and whose photograph from the period bear a genuine resemblance to the FBI's composite sketch: the same forehead, the same heavy-lidded eyes, the same forgettable ordinariness that made him so easy to overlook in a crowded terminal. Colleagues who knew him in that era have described a restless, guarded man capable of an unnerving, theatrical calm, the same calm that struck every flight attendant who sat near Cooper that night. It is tempting, given how well the pieces line up, to call this the end of the story. But intellectual honesty demands caution here, because this is exactly the point where so many previous Cooper theories have collapsed. Particles on a tie describe a world, not a person. That tie could have been purchased secondhand, borrowed, or brushed against a colleague's shoulder in a break room years before that November flight. Titanium residue tells you where a garment has been, not definitively who wore it onto a hijacked airliner, and certainly not whether that person survived the jump into the Washington wilderness. The candidate this new evidence points toward remains, honestly, exactly that, a candidate. An extraordinarily compelling one, arguably the strongest the case has ever produced, but not a confirmed identity, and not something the FBI has certified. That distinction matters, because it explains why this case has resisted closure for so long without any conspiracy or cover-up behind it. The file was worked hard and honestly for decades. The physical evidence that survived, a tie clip, a handful of decaying bills, and now a scatter of metal too small to see with the naked eye, simply never crossed the final threshold from a compelling story into a legally proven fact. The FBI formally suspended active investigation of the case in 2016, not because it had been solved, but because every reasonable lead had been exhausted and resources needed to move toward active threats. What the tie has given us is real, even if it isn't final. Before this analysis, the hijacker could have been almost anyone: a drifter, a disgruntled clerk, a veteran with a grudge, a fantasist who'd memorized an aviation manual from a library shelf. After it, the range narrows dramatically to a specific kind of man from a specific industrial world, someone who understood aircraft not as a passenger but as a builder. That is the closest thing to a fingerprint this case has ever produced, and it came not from a body or a weapon, but from a dollar store tie that a nervous man forgot to take with him into the storm. So where does that leave the legend, more than 5 decades on? It leaves a hijacker who did something no one else in American criminal history has managed, vanished cleanly, completely, and permanently, walking out of the back of a jet into freezing rain and simply ceasing to exist in any provable record. It leaves a partial ransom bundle pulled from a riverbank by a child, proof that at least some of that money never made it out of the wilderness. And it leaves a tie dusted with titanium, whispering the outline of a life lived among aircraft and alloys, pointing toward a name that fits almost everything, but that the record still won't let anyone carve in stone.